Hello, good evening and welcome. This is Sunday School for Sunday the 21st of February. How's your week been? I hope it's been prayerful and prosperous. Solomon was promised if he remained faithful to God, he and the nation of Israel would prosper. Similarly, we are told in several places, if we put God first, that we will prosper. There is a little bit of a problem here because we often relate prosperity to wealth, and they're not the same thing. In fact, sadly, often too much wealth destroys our prosperity, as we're likely to succumb to the greed that goes with it and may forget who provided the wealth and the prosperity in the first place. Solomon can be seen to have amassed great wealth, as was promised by God. Remember, he spent his formative life living in the wealth of his father David, so he was quite used to a high standard of living, although he seems to have surpassed that of David quite remarkably. In our chapter for today, the building of the temple is finished. The attention turns to the building of Solomon's palace and the fitting out of the temple. As anyone who's built a house knows, you can get that shell up, get the roof on, and get the walls all painted and nicely, but then you have to dress it up and make it nice. Solomon turned his attention to that. Pause the video and turn your Bible to 1 Kings chapter 7. Okay, I hope you're all there. 1 Kings chapter 7. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, and it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams on the pillars. And it was covered with cedar above the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and windows opposite window in 3 tiers. All the doors and windows had square frames, and the window was opposite window in 3 tiers. And he made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch in front of the pillars, and a canopy in front of them. He made the hall of the throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. His own house where he was to dwell in the other court back of the hall was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits. And above were costly stones cut according to measurement and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around, and the course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord, and the vestibule of the house. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of the widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was full of wisdom and understanding and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to Solomon and did all his work. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze, and set on the tops of the pillars. The height of one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other capital was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work in the wreaths of the chainwork for the capitals on top of the pillars, a lattice for one capital and a lattice for the other capital. Likewise he made pomegranates in 2 rows around the top lattice work. to cover the capital that was on top of the pillar, and he did the same on the other capital. Now the capitals that were on top of the pillars in the vestibule were of lily work, 4 cubits. The capitals were on 2 pillars, and also above the rounded projection which was beside the lattice work. There are 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar on the south and called its name Jachin, and he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. And on the tops of the pillars was lily work. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, and 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, compassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, and 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. The sea was set on them, and all their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like a brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It held 2,000 baths. He also made 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, and 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and panels were set in the frames, and on the panels that were set in the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Moreover, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and at the 4 corners were supports of the basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Its opening was within a crown that projected upward 1 cubit. Its opening was round as a pedestal is made, 1.5 cubits deep. And its opening there were carvings, and its panels were square, not round, and the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axles of the wheels were of 1 piece with the stands, and the height of the wheel was 1.5 cubits. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles and their rims, their spokes and their hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the 4 corners of each stand. The supports are of 1 piece with the stands, and on the top of the stand was a round band 1/2 cubit high. And on top of its stand, its stays and its panels were of 1 piece with it. And on the surfaces of its stays and on its panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees, according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. After this manner he made 10 stands. All of them were cast alike, of the same measure and the same form. He made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each basin measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. And he set the stands, 5 on the south side of the house, 5 on the north side of the house, and he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. Hiram also made the pots and the shovels and the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals were on the tops of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals were on the tops of the pillars. And the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars, the 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. Now the pots, the shovels, and the basins, all these vessels in the house of the Lord which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of Jordan the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because there were so many of them. The weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north, before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, the tongs, the gold, the cups, the snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, for the doors of the nave of the temple. Thus all the work of King Solomon did on the house of the Lord, and it was finished. Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Now, in the last chapter, chapter 6, we learned that Solomon spent 7 years building the temple. But here we learn that he spent another 13 years building his own house and fitting out the temple. The temple was glorious, but it seems that Solomon wanted a house that was much more glorious than the temple. Notice that he also built a similarly extravagant house for his bride, the Egyptian princess, to live in. This gave her status over all of Solomon's other wives. It shows that Solomon's own personal comfort and luxurious tastes have become very important in the life of Solomon. I would remind you what I said earlier. Wealth and prosperity are not the same thing. We're told that Solomon finished the work of building the temple. We can't say that the Christian has finished the work of spreading the gospel, because that is never ending. Similarly, our bodies, which are temples to the Lord, require constant attention, both physical and, more importantly, spiritual, to remain fit for the Lord's service. Solomon's palace was built of equally extravagant materials that he'd used for the temple. So much magnificent cedar wood from Lebanon was used to build Solomon's palace that he called it the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Walking in the richly panelled walls of the palace was like walking in a forest. The 45 pillars set in the House of the Forest of Lebanon also gave the impression of being in a majestic forest. Later, if we read on in chapter 10, we'll learn of the 500 gold shields that were hung in the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Isaiah, in chapter 22, specifically called this building an armory. We are left with the idea that this great temple that Solomon had built was pretty extravagant, but Solomon's palace was even better. If you ever get the opportunity to travel through old Europe, as they call it, you will come and see some magnificent buildings, mainly cathedrals. These amazing buildings were built hundreds of years ago at great labour and cost to poor people who could never dream of living in such spectacular places. When their most magnificent buildings were churches, it said something about their values. When Solomon made his palace more spectacular than the temple, it says something about his values. In our modern world, the most magnificent buildings are often given over to business, shopping, or entertainment. Does this say something about our values? In Haggai, chapter 1, verses 3 through 10, the prophet speaks powerfully to those who think more about their own house than they do about the house of God. Now, Hiram from Tyre, don't confuse him with Hiram, king of Tyre. Hiram from Tyre was a half Israeli and half Gentile, and he was the best craftsman around for making something in bronze. He was a worker of metals. Solomon hired him to do all his work, that is, the fine artistic work of the palace and especially the temple. He makes furnishings for the temple after the pattern of the tabernacle furnishings. He cast 2 impressive pillars of bronze, so noteworthy that they were given names. They were called Jachin and Boaz. In practical terms, the pillars were intended to be a reminder to successive kings that they were ruling by God's appointment and by God's grace, and that in God lay their strength. Some believe that the pillars were meant to remind Israel of the twin pillars of the Exodus, the constant reminders of the presence of God in the wilderness, the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of smoke by day. The house of God was a place where people experienced their relationship with God. At that house, people were given strength from the Lord. From this building, it should go out to the whole community. Come here, get established. Come here and receive the strength of God. Hiram didn't stop with just the pillars. He went on and cast a sea of bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other, a huge lava, more than 15 feet across, that was used for the ceremonial washings connected with the temple. In addition, Hiram made 10 lavers of bronze. Each laver contained 40 baths. These lavers were used by the priests in their ceremonial cleansing, and perhaps also to supply water to the standing basins for the rinsing of the offerings. The volume of this sea was about 2,000 baths, it says, which we calculate to be about 11,500 gallons, or for those who've gone metric, 43,500 litres. Into the treasuries of the house of the Lord he put all these great works of art and articles of great value that had been placed in the temple. This included 10 carts and the shovels and bowls that were needed utensils for sacrifices. Solomon brought in the things which his father had dedicated. God told David he could not build the temple, but David still collected furnishings and treasures for the temple that his son Solomon would build. Let's just digress for a minute. Solomon has really gone to extravagant lengths, firstly for the temple, but then to even more extravagant lengths for his own palace. One of the results of the restrictions of the current COVID pandemic has been the dramatic increase in people working on improving their homes. They're stuck at home, and so they're doing things. Companies that supply materials and products for home improvements have been enjoying remarkably high levels of business. Apparently, this is financed by money that is not being spent on travel, entertainment, or eating out. This is an illustration of where the priorities of many people lie. Perhaps it's a good time to ask ourselves where our financial targets should be. Whether we should be using some of these funds that are unused to give to the Lord. I'm not talking about tithing, but giving to the Lord over and above that. Does that suggestion hurt or offend you? If you're not spending so much on some things, maybe this is a time to give some extra to the Lord. Remember what Malachi says, chapter 3, verse 10. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse. But then he goes on to say, test me and see if I will not open the floodgates of heaven. Pray about this. Remember, this is the only thing that God invites us to test him about. See if God will not open the floodgates of heaven in blessings for you. Continue to pray about how God is using you and your talents to share the gospel with others. Be blessed. See you next week.